I didn't set out to question the foundations of our cities. I was researching Victorian-era construction techniques, examining old photographs of urban development, trying to understand how rapidly industrializing societies built so much so quickly. Standard architectural history, nothing controversial, in photograph after photograph across dozens of cities, the same peculiar feature kept appearing: ground-level windows half buried, ornate architectural details disappearing into sidewalks, elaborate stonework cut off at street level as if the buildings have been pushed down into the earth. Not in one city, not in one region, everywhere. The official explanation is straightforward. Streets were raised for sanitation and flood control. Cities built up their roads, burying the original ground floors. It happens. It's documented. Except when you look closer, the explanation starts to fracture, because these aren't crude first floors that were buried. These are architectural masterpieces, buildings with basement windows more elaborate than most modern buildings, main entrances, stonework that required master craftsmen, structural systems engineered with precision that shouldn't exist in that era, and all of it, according to the standard timeline, was built specifically to be buried almost immediately. Why would anyone do that? Let's start with what we can observe directly. In Seattle, an entire district lies beneath the current street level. In Chicago, miles of tunnels connect buried first floors. In Edinburgh, whole streets exist underground, complete with storefronts and residential spaces. Portland has its Shanghai tunnels. Rome, its multiple buried cities stacked vertically through history. Standard urban archaeology, you might say. Cities build on top of themselves. Nothing unusual there, except the timeline is wrong. These aren't ancient Roman ruins, buried by centuries of gradual accumulation. These are sophisticated 19th century structures buried within decades of their construction. In some cases within years, buildings that appear in photographs as street-level structures then reappear 20 years later, half submerged, with no documentation of why or how the streets rose several meters. The deeper I looked, the more the pattern repeated, not just in America or Europe, but worldwide. In Asia, in South America, in Africa, cities separated by oceans, supposedly developed independently, all showing the same architectural signature, the same buried windows, the same half-submerged ground floors, the same absence of documentation explaining why functional buildings were deliberately entombed. If you're finding this exploration valuable, consider how rarely these patterns are examined together. Each city's buried architecture is treated as a local curiosity, never connected to the global phenomenon. That isolation of evidence is worth questioning. The strangest part isn't that buildings were buried. Cities do rise over time. The strange part is the architecture itself. These buried levels weren't simple basement or service floors. They were primary entrances. They were elaborate public spaces. They featured architectural details that required significant investment and craftsmanship. And, according to the official narrative, they were all designed and built knowing they'd be buried almost immediately. That's not how construction works. That's not how economics works. That's not how human behavior works. This is where Tartaria enters the investigation, not as a definitive answer, but as a framework for organizing the anomalies. And around the same period, architectural patterns shift dramatically worldwide. Suddenly, cities everywhere begin constructing buildings with nearly identical design principles. Not similar, identical. The same proportions, the same structural logic, the same ornamental vocabulary. This happens across continents in regions with supposedly no contact, using construction techniques that official history describes as newly invented. Could these buildings represent inherited technology, architecture built according to design principles and construction techniques that weren't invented but rediscovered or repurposed? Structures that may have been completed, occupied briefly, then partially buried during some unrecorded cataclysm or systematic campaign of concealment. I'm not claiming this is what happened. I'm asking if the evidence pattern fits better with this interpretation than with conventional explanations. Let's examine what actually exists, not speculation, not theory, physical evidence you can verify yourself. First, the photographs. In city after city, historical photographs show buildings at different ground levels than they stand today, not slight variations, differences of 3, 4, sometimes 6 m. The photographs are dated and catalogued. The buildings are identifiable. The ground level has demonstrably changed, yet documentation explaining why this happened, when it happened, and how it was accomplished is consistently absent or inadequate. Standard explanations cite street raising projects, but the projects themselves are poorly documented. No comprehensive engineering plans survive for most cities. No detailed cost accounting, no contemporary newspaper coverage proportional to what would have been massive infrastructure undertakings. The projects that supposedly transformed entire urban landscapes left barely any administrative trace. Second, the buildings themselves. Look at the structural engineering. Many feature load-bearing walls that make no sense if the current ground level was the intended design. Support columns that terminated what is now underground as if they were designed for a different elevation. Drainage systems that flow upward from current street level. Ventilation systems positioned below ground that would have been functional only if the street level were lower. These aren't design mistakes. Easy are systematic features suggesting the buildings were engineered for a ground plane several meters below current street level. Third, the buried spaces themselves. When you can access them through basement conversions or urban exploration, you find something remarkable. Not crude storage areas, not unfinished basements, fully realized architectural spaces, finished walls, decorative elements, features that indicate these were meant to be occupied, seen, experienced as primary spaces. And here's where it becomes impossible to ignore. The sediment, the material burying these structures, isn't gradual urban accumulation, decades of trash and organic buildup compressing into soil. It's meters of mud, sand, and clay deposited rapidly. Geological layers that suggest catastrophic deposition, not slow urban development. In some locations, the buried levels show signs of having been flooded, filled with sediment, then abandoned, not gradually covered over generations, but buried suddenly. Now we arrive at the central mystery. Even accepting the official narrative, even assuming all these street-raising projects happened exactly as described, you're still left with an impossible coordination problem. How did dozens of cities across multiple continents, supposedly developing independently, all decide to raise their street levels within the same narrow time window? How did they all arrive at similar solutions? Why did the buildings show such architectural uniformity before the streets air raised? The conventional answer involves the industrial revolution, mass production, pattern, books, and international architectural movements. But that explanation requires something specific. Transition periods, you should see gradual adoption, regional variations, experimental phases, local adaptations. You don't. The architecture appears mature from its first documented instances. The construction techniques show no learning curve. The standardization appears immediately, not progressively. Consider the technology itself. These buildings feature advanced structural engineering, iron frameworks, complex load distribution, sophisticated ventilation and heating systems, materials processed to exacting specifications, and all of this supposedly emerged simultaneously across the world in the hands of builders who had no prior experience with such techniques. The standard industrial narrative assumes each city developed these capabilities independently through parallel innovation, but parallel innovation doesn't typically produce identical results. It produces variations on themes, different solutions to similar problems, regional styles reflecting local materials and traditions. That's not what we observe. We observe my ununiformity. We observe buildings in San Francisco that could stand in St. Petersburg without looking out of place. Structures in Melbourne that share design DNA with structures in Montreal, ornamental details that repeat across hemispheres with suspicious precision. This suggests something else, not parallel development but inherited templates, not independent innovation, but coordinated implementation of existing designs, as if builders worldwide were working from the same master plans, following specifications they didn't fully understand, completing structures whose original purpose had been lost. Here's what makes this truly disturbing: the documentary gaps. For such massive urban transformations, you'd expect comprehensive records, engineering surveys, municipal meeting minutes, contractor agreements, labor records, contemporary journalism, documenting the work, personal accounts from residents whose homes were being restructured. Some of this exists, but far less than you'd expect. And what does exist often contradicts itself. Dates don't align. Project descriptions are vague. Cost figures seem implausibly low for the work described. It's as if the official documentation was created after the fact, filling in a narrative to explain changes that had already occurred for undocumented reasons. Even more curious are the technological records. We're told these construction techniques were new, requiring significant innovation, yet patent records from the period show surprisingly little activity around the specific technologies that would have been necessary. The engineering journals of the era discuss theoretical principles but contain few detailed descriptions of practical implementation. The knowledge appears and is applied, but without the usual trail of experimentation and refinement. The silence is deafening. This is where the investigation becomes uncomfortable, because once you start looking for documentation and finding gaps instead, you have to ask why. Why would such significant projects leave so little trace? Why would transformative technologies appear without development, histories? Why would cities worldwide undergo similar changes with minimal coordination documented between them? The simplest answer is that the documentation was never created because the changes weren't planned in the way we're told. The alternative answer, darker and more difficult, is that records existed and were deliberately removed. Let's focus on something specific: precision. 19th century construction, according to standard. History was imprecise by modern standards. Hand tools, manual measurement, limited quality control, regional variations in materials and techniques. You should see inconsistency, adaptation, workarounds, but examine the buried structures. Look at the stonework. The joints are tight, beyond what hand tools should achieve. The load-bearing walls show engineering calculations that shouldn't exist without modern structural analysis. The proportions follow mathematical ratios that weren't formally codified until later. This isn't crude pioneer construction. This is sophisticated engineering implemented at scale. The heating systems alone are remarkable. Many buried structures contain complex NE2 RKS of air ducts, water pipes, and thermal distribution systems. These aren't simple fireplace arrangements. These are centralized systems requiring coordinated design and precise installation. They appear in buildings dated decades before such systems were supposedly invented. Then there are the acoustic properties. Multiple buried performance spaces when accessed show acoustic engineering that rivals modern concert halls. Wall angles calculated for sound reflection, ceiling heights optimized for resonance, material choices that enhance specific frequency ranges. All of this in structures that official history dismisses as utilitarian basements. The evidence suggests these weren't learning exercises. These were mature applications of advanced knowledge, which raises the critical question: where did that knowledge come from? If you're still with me, understanding that this investigation challenges comfortable assumptions, consider engaging directly with primary sources. The photographic evidence, the architectural surveys, the geological studies, all exist in public archives. The pattern is visible if you're willing to look. Here's what happened according to the evidence pattern, though not according to any official narrative, within a relatively brief period, sometime in the mid to late 19th century, functional architectural systems disappeared worldwide, not gradually phased out, not improved upon and replaced systematically, buried, both physically and in the historical wreck. Ord. The buildings were inmed beneath raised streets. The documentation was either never created or removed. The technological knowledge was either lost or deliberately suppressed, and an alternative narrative was constructed, explaining the existing architecture as newly built rather than inherited, describing the buried levels as intentional basements rather than original ground floors, attributing the sophistication to 19th century innovation rather than recovered capability. This wasn't accidental. The consistency across cities suggests coordination. The uniformity of the new street levels suggests planning. The architectural similarity of the buried structures suggests they came from a common source. And here's where Tartaria re-enters as more than geographic designation, because if there was a widespread architectural tradition, a technological system, a civilization that built these structures and then vanished from the record, you'd expect exactly what we observe. Inherited buildings used without full understanding. Advanced engineering applied without documented development, sudden burial and replacement with simpler systems, collective amnesia about what came before. The maps show Tartaria existing. The architecture shows sophistication, appearing without development history. The burial shows systematic concealment. The records show deliberate gaps. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Stand in one of these buried spaces if you get the chance. Feel the stonework. Observe the proportions. Note the acoustic properties, the thermal design, the structural sophistication. Then ask yourself, does this feel like a basement or does it feel like we're living in the attic? Because that's the unsettling implication that what we call ground level might be second story, that what we call sophisticated architecture might be simplified reconstruction, that what we call human progress might be recovery from regression. The evidence doesn't prove Tartaria as empire or civilization, but it does prove something was buried, literally and figuratively. Advanced architectural systems were entombed beneath our cities. Technological capabilities were lost or suppressed. Historical narratives were constructed that don't match the physical evidence. Why? That's the question that haunts this investigation. Was it catastrophe, some event that deposited meters of sediment rapidly, forcing survivors to build atop the ruins? Was it deliberate concealment, burial of evidence of a predecessor civilization to construct new historical narratives? Was it technological regression, loss of knowledge that left later generations unable to maintain or understand what they'd inherited? The answer matters, because if we're living amid the remains of more advanced systems, if our cities are built at top buried sophistication we no longer understand, then our assumptions about human progress need revision. The trajectory isn't inevitably upward. Knowledge can be lost. Capabilities can disappear. Civilizations can forget what they once knew. I started this investigation with curiosity about Victorian construction. I'm ending it with fundamental questions about historical continuity. How much of what we consider our architectural heritage is actually inherited from something older? How much of our technological progress is recovery rather than invention? How many times has human civilization reached sophisticated levels only to collapse and rebuild with partial knowledge? The buried windows suggest answers we're not comfortable considering. The missing records point to deliberate obscuring of those answers. The global patterns indicate this isn't local phenomenon but systematic transformation. And the silence, the institutional disinterest in connecting these patterns, the dismissal of these questions as conspiracy theory rather than legitimate historical inquiry, that silence suggests something important is being protected, not by shadowy organizations, but by comfortable assumptions, by narratives that place us at the apex of human achievement, rather than part way up a slope others climbed before us. Walk down any city street. Look at the basement windows. Notice how the architecture terminates at the sidewalk, how the proportions seem cut off, how the grandest details face downward. towards spaces now filled with earth. Ask yourself, was this designed to be seen from below ground? The evidence is everywhere, buried beneath our feet, waiting to be recognized. D for what it represents. Not basement, not sanitation. Projects, not Victorian innovation, but inheritance, recovery, the architectural remains of something we've forgotten how to see. The question isn't whether Tartaria existed. The question is what we're walking on top of and what we lost when we buried it.